Well, the 4K X17R2 is finally here. Now, I put an announcement on the channel just over a week ago when I saw it go up on Dell's website, and I ordered it the same day. Now, Dell have delivered this in absolute record time, so I was really surprised when this came through in about a week. If you watch my X17R2 review, you'll know one of my biggest gripes was the lack of a QHD or 4K panel. Now, Dell did give us the 4K panel on the X17R1, so on a machine of this price, it's only right that we got it on the X17R2 or a QHD option. Now, Dell have finally put that right by putting the 4K panel back in this model. Now, as I mentioned, I have already reviewed the X17R2 with the 1080p panels, both the 360 and the base panel. So I will put a link down below in the descriptions for that model, just in case you haven't seen the actual review. So this is going to be just a very quick video on how the 4K screen is on this laptop, how it performs in gaming, and how well it scales if you can't run it at its native resolution. Now, when this was also launched, there was only the X17R2 with a 3080 Ti or the 3060. We tested both of those in this machine. Now finally, they've also released the 3070 Ti version, so we decided to get that in with this screen so we could test that at the same time. I'm also going to be interested to see how well the 3070 Ti copes with this 4K panel. Now before we dig into some gaming and benchmarking of that 3070 Ti, I want to just quickly talk about this screen. Now yes, it is quite an expensive upgrade over the 1080p, but you're getting a fantastic panel with this 4K model. It's incredibly bright, it's got a great colour gamut, it also has the advanced Optimus and G-Sync, and although the response time isn't as fast as the 360Hz panel that's available in the 1080p, it's still incredibly responsive for gaming, making it a great all-round option for someone looking for a laptop for content creation as well as gaming, whereas the 1080p is a dedicated gaming panel. So as I've discussed before, if you're buying this machine purely for gaming, that 1080p is still a great panel and maybe a good place to save some money. But if you're looking at a machine for content creation, media consumption, and for gaming, then this 4K panel is absolutely fantastic. Now, when I reviewed the X17R2 with the 3080 Ti, we got the revised 330 watt slim power brick. If you buy this model with the 3070 Ti, Dell actually gives you the 240 slim power brick. And this model is a fair bit slimmer and smaller than the 330 watt model, obviously being only 240 watts, making this package even more portable than with the newly revised 330 watt. But in all honesty, both of these redesigned power packs are impressive for the size of the actual power they're outputting, and you'll be happy with either one that you get. So before we start looking at actual 4K footage on this screen, just want to briefly talk about the actual RTX 3070 Ti that we got in this laptop. This is our first hands-on with an Alienware with a 3070 Ti because they were delayed from the launch. We've tried the 3060 and we've had the 3080 Ti. So what we're going to do, we've run the usual suite of benchmarks, and I'm just going to put up the normal Time Spy, Firestrike, Shadow the Tomb Raider, and the Warhammer benchmarks. So we can see side by side the differences between these three cards. And obviously just a quick summary to show you the differences between the 3060, 3070 Ti and 3080. Now all these benchmarks were running at 1080p. Now because this is our first time with an RTX 3070 Ti on these Alienwares and we've got this 4K panel, we wanted to see how well this card would cope with the 4K screen. Now the good news is if you're running esports titles such as Dota or CSGO, you can run it at 4K resolution and game at high settings with no problems at all, and it'd be well over 150 frames per second. A really great experience, so you do not even need to drop the resolution for those sort of titles. But obviously as you play more demanding titles, you may need to drop that resolution. So what we want to do is test the scaling. So the first game we tested was Apex. Now it's not the most demanding of games, but you want a high frame rate, otherwise you do feel like you're at a disadvantage in this title. So at 4K, we were finding Apex was running about 100 frames per second and high settings with the 3070 Ti. That's really quite impressive. Now, as I said, it's not the most demanding of games. And if you get the 3080 Ti version, you get even higher frames per second. But we did want to try dropping it down to 1440p to see how well this panel scales. And the great news is, at 1440p, this looks incredibly crisp. I didn't even notice I wasn't playing it at non-native resolution. It scales really well, it still feels responsive, and you don't get that soft image you do get with some panels when they're off mesh. And by dropping it to 1440p, we've got about an extra 30% of the frames per second over the 4K resolution. Now lastly, we want to drop it to 1080p and see how well that looks. And on Apex at 1080p, it still looks incredibly crisp. It's not looking soft like it's off mesh, but you can see obviously you're running at 1080p sort of texture, so it doesn't look as nice and crisp as when you're running it at 1440p or at 4K. But still, very, very respectable. And when you used to scale panels years ago, that used to look terrible, but on this panel, it looks incredible. So you can happily buy this 4K screen and run non-native and still have really good performance. So After Apex, we wanted to try Warzone because it's a bit more of a demanding title on both the CPU and the GPU. And in Warzone, at 4K, at all high settings, what we did find is that we were playing at about 60 to 80 frames per second, which is more than playable, especially because the panel is very responsive. But if you're a dedicated player playing to win, you're going to want higher frames per second. So we dropped it down to 1440p. And the good news is, again, it looks fantastic. And I reckon on this panel, 1440p is going to be the sweet spot for a lot of games, especially the more demanding games. And at 1440p, we're getting just over 100 frames per second. Dropping it again to a further 1080p still looked good. Apart from, as you can see, obviously you can see you're running at 1080p because of the textures. But it still looks crisp and not soft as if you're running it off mesh. And then obviously you're getting even more frames per second as you'd expect for 1080p with a 3070 Ti. So either way, if you buy this panel and you're running it non-native, you're still going to get great performance. And particularly at 1440p, you probably won't notice that much difference over the 4K. And you certainly won't notice that you're running a monitor non-native. So definitely worth doing to get those frame rates up. So to sum things up, this 4K panel is absolutely incredible. I feel a bit stupid now not buying this last year. Last year I stuck with the 1080p panel because I knew that you wouldn't be able to game a lot of the games I play at 4K resolution, even with the 3080. And my previous experience of running non-native hasn't always been the best. But having had this panel in now and realising how many games you can actually run at 4K and yet running at QHD still looks incredible, it's well worth getting this panel in, especially if you're buying this laptop for gaming and for work and media consumption. Now, if you're just planning on gaming and you want high frames per second, then the 1080p panel is still a great choice. You'll save some money and you're going to get great frames per second in every game you play, no matter which card you buy, whether the 3060 or the 3080 Ti. It doesn't matter. So my advice still stands true. If you're just gaming, if you're not going to be working and not doing media creation and consumption, the 1080p is still a great choice. But if you are planning on doing other things with your laptop, then this 4K panel is excellent. And I have to admit, I'm going to eat my hat here, and I'd certainly consider buying this for myself. Now, I realise this is a bit like Marmite when you're talking about 4K on a laptop. So, as usual, put your comments down below. What do you think of the 4K panel on this X17? Do you think it's overkill for a 17-inch laptop? Do you think QHD is still the sweet spot? Or do you think you should go with that 1080p panel and save the money? Let me know. Always interested to hear your thoughts. And as usual, thanks for watching.